We're very excited to be hosting Calvin Trillin, who's here to talk about his new book, The Lede, Dispatches from a Life in the Press. And what a life he's had. He's, of course, a highly respected and beloved journalist, humorist, a food writer, poet, memoirist, and novelist. But as he's widely known, has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1963, having started in journalism only a couple of years before that. Along the way, he also at various times has done a humor column for The Nation and also a column for Time magazine. The Lede is only his 32nd book. It's a collection of pieces. As many of you know, he has a habit actually of collecting his pieces into articles, into books. You know, and the pieces have been they range from his articles to his comic sketches and verse, it's quite a nice position to be in, to be able to recycle as he does.
I'm happy you use that word. I try to save the earth by recycling.
Yeah, there's that too.
And my only other comment about that kind introduction is that it's a little embarrassing to have written that many books. Isaac Asimov at one point had done something like 350 books or something like that, and I was with a group of people I didn't know very well at a sort of Christmas party for King Features, and I said, he's written, whatever it is, 328 books. What's the point of that? I mean, satisfaction or money or something, you just can't really. And the guy next to me, who I had just met, said, I've written 175. And I said, well, 175, sure, but I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's okay, but I mean, 32 is pretty good, let me tell you. So the pieces in Bud's latest book, The Lede, are diverse. You know, some are very serious reporting pieces, some are short pieces that are meant to amuse, some are sort of in between, but all have to do in one way or another with journalism. And as Bud notes at the start of the book, he's been writing about the press for about as long as he's been in the game. As you can see, I'm going to be the one moderating here today. It's quite an honor for me, but first, how about welcoming our very distinguished guest?
Thank you.
So you know, Bud, you actually you have a very short bio, and it's quite easy to recite. Actually, it consists basically of a single sentence, namely, Calvin Trillin is a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker who also has been a columnist for Time and The Nation. I mean, that kind of sums it up, right? So what's it like?
It actually padded it a little bit.
Yeah, sometimes I see they leave off The Nation and Time and just leave you at the New Yorker. But I mean, but speaking of The New Yorker, I mean, what's it like having been identified so closely for so long? I mean, 61 years with a single publication.
Is it 61 years? They certainly haven't thrown me any party, I can tell you that. Well, it's great. I mean, I think the New Yorker, for the first 20 or 30 years I was there, I always thought if Harvard Business School or the McKinsey consulting company did a study of the New Yorker, they would come up with the conclusion that it couldn't possibly come out the next week. Because it was run just by William Shawn, I think it's more regularized now, if that's a word.
If it isn't, you just made it one. That's
yeah, it's not a bad word. We'll keep that word.
yeah.
But I always reporters basically complain a lot about where they work. They tend to look at the magazine in the same way they might look at the agriculture department or something like that, looking for ways when it really wasn't doing what it said it did, and that kind of thing. So I think that that remark that Winston Churchill was supposed to have made, and I think with Winston Churchill and Yogi Berra and a couple of others, you have to take that with a grain of salt, but he apparently said, democracy is the worst system of government there is, except all the others. But all in all, it's been a pleasant time at the New Yorker.
Let me ask you why you chose to build this particular book now around journalism, because as with your previous collections, I mean they've been about some particular subject, and you say at the start of the lead that you put this collection together thinking that disparate pieces from various places and various styles would provide a useful picture from multiple angles of what the press has been like over the span of your very long career. But why focus on journalism at this particular time?
Well, I think the short, honest answer, which I regrettably am going to give, is that I like these pieces, and then I think, actually, as I remember, Random House suggested when I proposed this, suggested to my agent that I do a general collection of the best of the. I had already done a book of attempts at humor called Quite Enough of Calvin Trillin, and I think it's just easier to if you have a subject to talk about, and the press interests the press. I mean, I wasn't sure I was going to go into journalism, but and my father thought at the very last moment, he sort of panicked when I got out of college and didn't know what I wanted to do, and he said I should go to law school and come back to Kansas City and join the law firm that represented him, I said I don't want to go to law school. I've seen those movies. Usually the character is somebody like Clark Gable, and the meeting is over and he snaps his briefcase shut and says, "I'll have my lawyers draw up the papers." So some schlemiel is back there drawing up papers. Well, I said, I don't do that. So he sent my Uncle Jerry, who I used to refer to as the leading intellectual of Saline County, Kansas. He was the city librarian of Salina, Kansas at the time, and he was in New York for some conference. And my father said, "Go up and persuade Bud to go to law school." And I said, I really don't want to go to law school. I don't want to draw up the papers. And Uncle Jerry said, "I don't blame you." I mean, so there wasn't any serious pressure.
Well, I think it's fair to say you made a great career choice, or anyway, you made the best out of the choice that you made. You got early on in your career, you got into the subject of race. I mean, your first article for the New Yorker was an Education in Georgia, which was your account of the desegregation of the University of Georgia. But even before that, when you were with Time for a year or two, you were assigned, of course, to the Atlanta Bureau, where you were able to cover the civil rights struggle. How formative an experience, looking back, was that?
I think it was very formative. In the first place, if you're a young reporter or a young writer, it really helps to believe, at least partly, that what you put on the then page, now screen, is of interest to people, and it helps a lot if I think, and this was accidental in my case, if there's a subject that you could write about that gives you the impression you know more than the reader about this, and in my case it was the civil rights struggle, which was pure luck, because some years, as you may remember, nothing really happened, and so a year in the Atlanta Bureau of Time would mean a year of calling up the guy from Citizens and Southern National Bank and asking him what he thinks is going to happen with the interest rates. And I think that I would have started to think about law school at that point. But the civil rights struggle was a fantastically interesting story, partly because it didn't involve, except at a level that and a place that I wasn't involved in, which is Washington, D.C., it didn't involve important government poobahs of one sort or another, but they were regular people, normal people who had to decide in New Orleans, for instance, am I going to send my 6-year-old little black girl through that crowd of women yelling obscenities at kids who go in? That's a hard decision. And they actually sort of took on airs, those women who were yelling. I asked one of them a question at one point, and she said, "I only speak to Martin Agronsky." And they practically had press aids after a while. Oddly enough, 50 years later, at the some event, I met one of the kids and I said, I was standing in front of the school and you were going in. It's nice to see you all grown up. And I think that learning a lot by accident or just because it's your job about one subject, I think that's helpful to a writer. And also, it was an exciting story, and also Charlene Hunter and I are still pals. And when she was at the University of Georgia, Hamilton Holmes, the other student, lived off campus, but Charlene lived in a dorm. And he got a lot of harassment, and we talked on the phone now and then. And at one point, she talked about coming from Savannah back to Atlanta after a speech, I said she was unhappy with the train trip, and I said, "Well, here is a good train, the train from Savannah." And she said, "Not where we have to sit." And I had read all these books about segregation and how it came about, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that knowledge just drained out of my head. And I said, "They can't make her sit back there. She's a friend of mine. It's personal." And I think I started to understand it is totally personal. And there's a black comedian named Gerard something, I can't remember his name, who said something great. I thought he said, "Being black in America is exhausting." Carmichael, I think his name is, and so it was a dramatic story and a story that you could see yourself changing while doing it.
You know, of course, the last selection of in the book deals with the year that you spent covering the South, and you touch on the question of journalistic objectivity in the face of evil, and this is it's a recurring issue. It's much being debated again. The whole question of objectivity in journalism today, and here's a little bit of what you write. I didn't pretend that we were covering a struggle in which all sides, the side that thought, for instance, that all American citizens had the right to vote, and the side that thought that people who acted on such a belief should have their houses burned down, had an equally compelling case to make. It wasn't like trying to remain objective while covering the Michigan-Ohio State game. So what does objectivity in journalism mean to you, and when is it okay to take a side?
Well, I think it just means it's fairness. I think, it's in the book. There was a Canadian press lord, who's called, named Black, Conrad Black, and I did a profile of him or a story about him. He renounced his Canadian citizenship in order to become a member of the House of Lords in England, and at one point and I criticized him some, but also said some of the papers that he had started were lively, interesting papers, I think he said at one point that to somebody, to a reporter, that he thought that all in all my story about him was okay. I have to admit that the other people writing about him were pretty nasty, so it might have been easy to satisfy him. But I think it's like a lot of things about journalism. I think it's just common sense that if you're fair, that somebody can't complain. Johnny Apple, for instance.
Who's also profiled in the book.
Yeah, R.W. Apple Jr. The profile of him begins something like, there's a consensus in the trade, I'm happy to report, that R.W. Apple Jr. of the New York Times is easier to take than he once was. And Johnny himself says, and I think I quote him in the book, about Tim Krause's book on the boys in the bus, that some people, when he was reporting in Iowa, say, some people thought that he was a great reporter, some people thought he was an asshole. And I don't think. The other thing is that I think people get offended by something you hadn't even realized was offensive. They pick something out of a piece and say, that's terrible. And the thing that really was wounding, they pass up. They don't care.
And some of the best pieces in the book are definitely the profiles of these legendary, colorful journalists like Johnny Apple or Edna Buchanan, who covered the police for the Miami Herald. It seems that such iconic characters don't exist in journalism anymore, or are fewer and far between, or am I just failing to recognize some of them?
I think that the platforms are different, so you don't. I mean, Edna Buchanan worked for the Miami Herald for a number of years, but one year I think there were 650 murders in Miami. So for a crime reporter who specializes in murder, and has a newspaper willing to print it. I mean, today there are fewer characters like that because there are fewer newspapers and there are fewer opportunities. But Edna, well, she loved murder, and also she was relentless. In a conversation with her, when she's asking the questions, the conversation never ends when you think it's going to end. There's always one more question. And she told me once that covering a murder, if you go to the location, there's often too much yellow tape put by the police that you can't get in. So she goes back to the office and uses the telephone and calls, and if the person who picks up the phone says something like, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself at a time like this," et cetera, and slams the phone down, Edna counts to 60 and then calls back. And she figures that in that minute, in the first place, the person she talked to might change his mind. Somebody on the other side of the room might say, "You should have talked to that reporter. The way people are being killed in Miami is a disgrace." She doesn't call the third time. She said that would be harassment. And Johnny Apple was such a storied character that there actually there's a subgenre of reporter stories. They're called Apple stories, and they're about Apple. One of them in the Krauss book was when Apple got back from
Boys on the Bus.
Boys on the Bus, yeah. Got back from Vietnam. He was talking to somebody in the newsroom and allowed that he had killed a couple of people himself. And an older reporter was standing nearby, and he said, "Women and children, I presume." So he was great for his own quotes, but also great for the quotes he attracted.
So Bud, many people, I'm sure many in this room would consider you one of the all-time greats in journalism.
This would be a good time to mention the word dashing. It fits into the program.
Okay, the dashing Bud Trillin. But talk about your own process in writing, say, a long profile about someone. How do you go about it?
Well, I actually haven't written as many profiles as a lot of writers who have been there for a long time. It's a more difficult form, and it used to be. I don't know if it's still true. The New Yorker paid more for a profile than for something that would go under the title of reporter at large or something like that. And I finally, I think maybe the first one I did was about Penn and Teller. And then I found out that means talking to two groups of childhood friends, two old teachers. How did I get myself into this? Well, I used to have a method. For 15 years, I did a piece for the New Yorker every 3 weeks from somewhere in the country. Magazine writers would say, "How do you keep up the pace?" And newspaper reporters would say, "What else do you do?" I did have a method. I would come home, and the next day I would, without even looking at my notes, would start writing a piece that was going to be roughly that piece. And sometimes I didn't even get all the way to the end. And often the language deteriorated pretty quickly as I went. And then the next day I would do half of the rough draft, and the next day the other half. Some people think that I actually left in the middle of a sentence if I had gotten to the half that I didn't have to write anymore, but I don't think I ever did that. And then I would type it up on what, Brad, were they called? Carbon packs? Those things with had white paper on top and then a carbon, then 2 or 3 copies. And I did that at the New Yorker. I did the others at home because I had 2 daughters there with me. And so I had this awful feeling at times that what we called that first draft was the vomit out. And it was pretty rough. And I was always afraid that the cleaning women would find it on my desk and find it hilarious, and they would smack their brooms against the desk like hockey players, and they'd say, "He calls himself a writer." So that's the closest I've ever come to a method, really.
Well, let's talk specifically about the lead, because that, of course, is the title of the book, and you actually have a piece that talks about one of your favorite leads that appeared in a paper in Louisiana, The Advocate of Baton Rouge, just a few years ago. And let me read this lead. It's kind of long, but bear with me. A veterinarian prescribed antibiotics Monday for a camel that lives behind an Iberville Parish truck stop after a Florida woman told law officers she bit the 600-pound animal's genitalia after it sat on her when she and her husband entered its enclosure to retrieve their deaf dog. Now, there's a lot going on in that sentence.
It's a masterpiece.
Why do you love that one?
One sentence. No punctuation. You don't see too many leads like that anymore, do you? No, it's unusual.
It's unusual.
But of course, what you just read is the funniest thing in the book, and I didn't write it. You don't need a method when something like that appears. You just need to assemble some sort of structure to hold it there, so people can read it. I wasn't able to read it out loud without laughing for a long time, particularly when you get to the deaf dog. That seems like that extra little touch. They're yelling, "Hey, Fido! Hey, Fido!" The dog doesn't hear them.
So the first, your book's divided, of course, into 6 or 7 sections. The first section is titled "The Trade," which is how you refer to journalism, broadly speaking. Some people call journalism a profession, although technically it isn't, because journalists don't need licenses or certifications. Others refer to it as a business or an industry. But what do you like about the term trade?
You know, I didn't consciously pick that out. I agree with you. It's definitely not a profession, and I think reporters sort of think of themselves as sort of important people in society at their peril. When you see those reporters at the gridiron dinner with some celebrity guest and all dressed up in tuxedos, and it's like in social standing, reporters really are somewhere between the people who own the tuxedos and the guy who's valet parking the car.
Well, in fact, you say at one point that no matter how much money journalists make, they forget at their peril that they are essentially cabin class people traveling first class on an upgrade.
Yeah, that's in the days when transatlantic thing. A friend of mine who was a reporter for the Sunday Times of London, when I asked him what class his family was coming over, he said, well, cabin class, journalists travel cabin class. I mean, they had it all settled. We didn't have it settled, and I did a piece once for a travel magazine. I can't remember which one, and somebody who reviewed the book that it was in, somebody who wasn't cognizant of Johnny Apple's type of expense account, said they're interesting stories, but of course they're only available to people like the author of the upper middle class. I called my sister in Kansas City and I said, we finally made it.
So but I should note that although you do single out some of the greats in journalism, there are many in journalism who, as you well know, toil behind the scenes, and one such person was John Murphy at the New Yorker. But he did no writing there, and you do include a tribute to him. What's special about John Murphy? Tell us about him.
Well, he had the Irish touch. He worked in the composing room. I don't know what they called it when they put the magazine together.
Makeup department.
Makeup department. That's a better name for that. And he when someone would ask you who's really funny at the New Yorker, particularly if people have read things about the Round Table and everything, and they're disappointed to hear Johnny Murphy, who works in the makeup room, and of course Johnny Murphy was of Irish origins, and there's a phrase in Ireland. The definition of a writer is a failed talker, and he could motion you over and start a story that was captivating, and it was about what happened to him on the commuter train. And it took about 5 minutes before you realized that story was told by a person without the gift at the Knights of Columbus meeting last night. I mean, as many times as he did that, I fell for it an embarrassing number of times. I did one, or maybe my wife asked me, how can so many things happen on that one commuter train? Well, Johnny told me.
So we're going to go to audience questions in a second. If you have one that you'd like to ask, please line up at the microphone over here. Let me ask you one general question.
Okay.
So looking at journalism over the time that you've been doing it, I mean, how has the role of journalism changed, or at least the perception of journalism and journalists?
Well, I think years ago, in that same movie that Clark Gable played the businessman who was going to have the guy draw up his papers. The journalist was a guy with sort of a greasy suit and probably some cheap bourbon in the lower right-hand drawer of his desk. And now there are journalists who went to Harvard. I mean, there's always been one or two of those.
You went to Yale, right?
Oh my God, I forgot that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not Harvard, yes.
No. Yeah, it's true. That was my father's doing also. My father read a book called Stover at Yale when he was, I guess, 11 or 12 or something. It was one of those heroic turn of the last century books. And just decided that that's where the industrialists send their sons, and that I should go to Yale. And he hadn't gone to college, and so I went to Yale. So I'm blaming that on him. But it was it's certainly where I sort of edged my way into the trade. I always like to say the college papers version of objectivity is we try to be equally inaccurate about both sides. So it's sort of natural to drift into journalism. I think a lot of people my age did that. The novel wasn't working out, or they were bored doing something else. And I think particularly after Watergate, that changed some, where people actually talked about wanting to go into journalism. But there were, I think that happened. And now. It's a little different because you can't just go to a newspaper or a smaller. I think the way most people worked it is they went to a small newspaper and then went to a bigger paper, and it was all made sense. But I don't know now that what somebody graduating from Harvard, Yale, and they have tape recorders, and in Washington you see those sort of scrums. You see them all holding out their tape recorder, and they actually know how to use it. People in my generation are not good at that, so it's changed, but in another way it's the same. There's still what I think are now called long form pieces. It's just that I think it's a little more difficult to find a place to put them.
Okay. We're going to take a few questions, but we're going to stop a little early because Bud would like to sign some books. He also has a train to catch. So why don't we, yeah. Or he can take a later train. Okay, great. Well, that means he can sign more books.
I will dash for it.
Okay, go ahead.
Dwight Garner wrote a review of this book, and that's how I knew about it and decided to come. And he seems to think you have another career, and he says he knows people who would attend the funerals of people they never met because word had spread that Trillin would be speaking. And I wondered how you felt about this sentence, and in a manner such as, a non-NBA fan would attend a Knicks game solely because he heard that Shaka Khan would be singing the national anthem. So I kind of wondered how it felt to be compared to Shaka Khan.
Well, I felt better about it after I asked one of my daughters who Chaka Khan was. It sounded like a foreign prime minister to me. So it depended on which country you were talking about. But it was very nice of him to say. So I didn't realize that it sounds sort of ghoulish being an obituary person. And some of the obituaries are from the New Yorker or the New York Times, and some of them are from memorial services, and they're people whose lives were really interesting. So it's not difficult to write an obituary of, say, Russell Baker or Molly Ivins, who we all adored, and who said about one member of the Texas legislature, if his IQ dips any further, we'll have to water him twice a day. As she would have said, she was a caution.
Well, thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to welcome you back to Washington. The last time I was in your company was at the F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Festival several years ago, and when Garrison Keillor was our honoree, and you were our keynote speaker and good friend to him, and I was the crazy lady driving you around in the BMW convertible. I don't know if you remember that, but. So it's just good to have you back, and I'm looking forward to this book, and I wondered if you had anything you wanted to say about your experience during the festival.
Well, I'm not here to boast, but I was a judge at the Stella yelling contest. That's where the judges are on a sort of a balcony in Jackson Square, and the people who are competing stand on the street, costumed. One of them costume is Stella, and the other one costume is Stanley. I'm sorry, they're upstairs, and the contestants are down there, and then they yell, Stella. And what amazed me about it, I think I did it 2 years, what amazed me about it is that we were told to rate them from 1 to 5, but on what ground? Nobody ever said. And I said, how could this work? I thought, and in both cases, when they counted up the ballots, we were pretty consistent. So you can. You can quantify Stella yellings. I guess that's good to know, but anyway, I enjoyed it, and I like New Orleans. I was just there.
Good to see you again.
Thanks.
Hello. I'm from Buffalo, New York, and you wrote an article once about buffalo wings.
I did, and somebody sent me a book of it was called something like it wasn't Oxford, but it was like the Oxford Book of American Food or something, and they list various dishes, and I am blamed for buffalo chicken wings.
Kind of. So
yeah.
I spent 20 years in Buffalo.
Right.
Everybody. The common story is that Frank and Teresa Bellissimo, the owners of the Anchor Bar, created the chicken wing.
Right.
Your article points out that the African American culture in Buffalo had been making wings for years.
Right.
John Young and his Mumbo Wings.
Yeah.
And just recently, everyone started to come around to the idea that actually black people were making chicken wings in Buffalo long before this tourist institution kind of took over. And it always amazed me that you showed up in town, you're not from Buffalo, and you sussed out something that I think people my age have only just started coming around to in like 2023. I wanted to ask you what it's like to go into a town as a roving reporter, and how do you try to kind of find the stories like that maybe people know but don't know? You know, the stories that are just underneath there that have been there, but like even if you're from there, you might not know it. How did you do that?
Well, I knew that there was something there before I went. I mean, in any story, I didn't just go cold.
Sure.
But with buffalo chicken wings, and for those, if there are few people in America who are unfamiliar with buffalo chicken wings, the wings aren't on the buffalo. It's
Confirmed.
now that's correct, right? Yeah. And John Young, he threatened to sue me and the New Yorker every few years. I think when cash got low, but he never did do it. He just sent letters. And they were wings, but they were, and it says so in my piece, that they weren't cut up the same way, and you didn't have the dressing and the celery. For one thing, what is sometimes known in the trade as parachuting in, there's some disadvantages to it, in the sense that on a murder story, you're not the person who knows the prosecutor because their kids are in camp or together. You're a stranger. On the other hand, you pick up things that people have forgotten are the way people in Buffalo talk, for instance. So there's some advantage and some disadvantage. And in the case of buffalo chicken wings, it's an interesting subject to me, and it fits in with Buffalo, which is sort of has an image of a working class place, and also I had some friends there who were buffalo chicken wing fanatics, so I guess at the end of all of this career, if that's the word, I will end up being credited for bringing buffalo chicken wings to the American public. I told you I wasn't here to brag.
Thank you.
Just to follow up, you've had a remarkable career. You've really started out covering the civil rights movement, as you mentioned. You covered serious politics. I have a book of yours called Killings, which is about many of your collected stories about murders. You did a number of interesting murders from around the country. You've done a lot. And then there's this whole food thing. There's Alice Let's Eat and all. You know, I have been to Arthur Bryant's just because of you. I went to Bow Bridge Crawfish Festival just because of you. And I just, how did you sort of get off to this seemingly very popular side road from your other serious reporting?
Well, it's an interesting question. Again, it was sort of accidental. In the middle of doing these pieces every 3 weeks for 15 years, at times doing 2 or 3 disputes or murders or something in a row, it sort of wore me down, and I was ready for something lighter. And I realized that food, in a way, eating, not food, but eating, was a way of writing about the country without concentrating on politics or show business or celebrity or something like that. And I can't remember the first piece. I think the first piece was about Cincinnati, Chile. And the interesting thing about my doing that, I don't know anything about food. I can't tell you what something is supposed to taste like or anything like that. It's sort of like, I don't really like to call strangers on the telephone, so why am I a reporter? I know nothing about food, so why was I writing about eating? But for instance, I think the first piece was about Cincinnati, Chile, the first food piece, and I wasn't interested in who actually had the best Cincinnati chili in Cincinnati, whether it was, I can't remember the name, the Skyline was one of them, right. There's some Skyline fans here, if you want to know the name. I was interested in the fact that people in Cincinnati think that chili is something that goes over spaghetti and can be ordered by the number, like give me a 3-way or a 4-way, and is cooked mainly by Macedonians. It's not what the rest of the country thinks of when they hear the word chili. So that to me was interesting, not whether Skyline was better than the other one, the two big rivals. I did find that a sort of relief from the more serious stories, and also at the time, I think Craig Claiborne was the first serious food critic in the New York Times, but food was written, eating and food in restaurants were written a lot about what was called fine dining, and when I knew people in New York from Kansas City, and when they got together, they didn't talk about the fine dining restaurant in Kansas City, which is like the fine dining restaurant in Houston or Denver or anywhere else. They talked about what I think you'd call vernacular food, the stuff that's attached to that city, and also if you came in from out of town and somebody wanted to take you to dinner, despite the fact that you insisted that you like simpler fare, would take you to a restaurant that I called La Maison de la Casa House, continental cuisine. And I used to think, what continent is this? I figured it was Antarctica, where everything's frozen. It just happened.
So I was lucky enough to hear you a couple of nights ago at the Free Library in Philadelphia. Right. And I'm lucky to be here now for a wedding. But you closed, or close to closed, with a very interesting poem about O.J., and I wondered if you'd grace this audience with the title and then, of course, the poem.
Sure. This is an attempt to do the American thing where boys are supposed to try to outdo their fathers. And my father was a grocer for most of his working life, but at one point he had a restaurant, and he used to put a couplet on the menu every day, different couplet. So I'm sort of a second generation poet. He liked poems about pie. And my favorite of his poems, the meter's not great. He wasn't fussy about the meter. Was eat your supper, Mom said gently to her little son, Roddy. If you don't, I'll break every bone in your body. But his shortest poem was, Don't sigh, eat pie. Well, of course, I had to, for years and years, try to write a shorter poem than that. And the titles don't count in these things, but the title is the political, societal, and philosophical implications of the O.J. Simpson trial. And the poem was, O.J., oy vey. That's a short poem.
Yeah, well, we were going to end on that note, but go ahead. Go ahead.
That's a great note to end on. Years ago, I started a career in magazines at U.S. News, and everybody said you got to read Floater, which is so fun, and your story about working in different beats.
Right.
And you said something really great about how to get out of the religion beat. I wondered if you want to share
I
that.
still remember that because I sort of liked moving around. This was some of you may remember something called group journalism. It was practiced by Time and Newsweek, where there are reporters out in the field writing these long pieces, files they were called, and then somebody in New York taking that and what it gets from Washington and what you steal from the New York Times and writing a 70-line piece about it, something like that. And the people who ordinarily did the section, there was like a medicine writer, there was a sport writer, became sort of expert on what they were doing. And then they'd go on vacation and the floater would come into art. He had been in show business the week before. He somehow wrote with the same authority. We called it instant omniscience. And I got sort of tired of writing the religion column. It looked like it was going to be okay at the beginning because they had a piece on some sect in Egypt that was banned because they were making an unholy racket. And I like that as a sect, making an unholy racket. But then I got tired of it, and so I started putting alleged in front of any historical religious event. The alleged parting of the Red Sea, the alleged crucifixion. The senior editor just crossed out the alleged. I mean, time in they had a lot of experience with smart Alex.
All right. Well, I think we could spend the rest of the afternoon just hearing you go over some of your greatest hits, Bud. Thank you so much for coming and spending this time with us, and we hope to see you back here soon, sometime again. You've got some time to spend signing, so he'll be up here at the table. Books are available at the checkout desk. Please form a line to the right of the table, and do not fold up your chairs.